You want to buy a new lens but don't know where to start because everything is so overwhelming? Let me make you an expert in only a few minutes to avoid buying the wrong lens. The first thing you need to decide on is focal length. But what is focal length? I don't want to bore you with physics. It's the number that is written on your lens. For example, the kit lens that comes with most entry-level cameras has a focal length of 18 to 55 millimeters.
Why is it listed as a range instead of a single number? Because you have a zoom ring on the lens that lets you zoom in and out. Zooming in means that you get a longer focal length, so a bigger number. Zooming out means that you get a shorter focal length, so a smaller number.
On the other hand, there are so-called prime lenses that don't have the option to zoom in and out, but have a fixed focal length. For example, this very popular 50mm lens. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, which we will discuss later.
To give you an idea about how the different focal lengths change the look of your images, I have set up an experiment. I'm here on the Danube in my hometown Vienna, and the distance to these skyscrapers over there is half a mile or 800 meters. Before we quickly dash through the most common focal lengths from extremely wide to extreme telephoto,
I need to explain something very important.
The size of your sensor makes a big difference when it comes to how the images look, even when using the very same lens. To better demonstrate, I have created this wooden mock-up of a camera. The white rectangle on the inside represents the camera sensor. The size of this sensor is that of a so-called full-frame sensor, and it would get me this image. Now, if I had a smaller sensor, it would obviously crop a part of the image and give me a totally different shot. That cropping is the reason why the smallest sensors are called crop sensors. Unfortunately, not all crop sensors have the same size, so there is some need for a reference to compare the focal lengths on different sensor sizes.
And that reference is called the crop factor. What does it tell you? Let me quickly show you a real-life example. Here I have two cameras, one with a crop sensor and one with a full-frame sensor. I will first use the full-frame camera and take a self-portrait. And then I will leave the lens on the tripod and use the crop sensor camera with the very same lens. As you can see, when we compare the images, the crop sensor camera basically zooms in, and the crop factor tells you how much it zooms in. If I use a crop sensor camera with a crop factor of 1.5 by, it basically means that it zooms in 1.5 by. So a 100mm lens would basically become a 150mm lens. Don't let that confuse you. I will link you to a video that explains everything in detail at the end of the video. For now, I have made things easy.
To show you the difference between a crop and a full-frame sensor of all the focal lengths that we will be testing, I have added this wide rectangle to the images. That will show you the field of view that you would get from a typical crop sensor, a so-called APS-C sensor, while the full image would be that of a full-frame sensor. I will start with a rather extreme focal length, 14mm. Lenses with such an extreme wide angle of view are called ultra-wide-angle lenses. These kind of lenses are often used for landscapes to get a big angle of view, or for interior architecture to make rooms look bigger than they actually are. As you can see, they add a lot of distortion, particularly when placing subjects near the corner or the edge of your images. So when photographing people or geometric shapes, be aware that they might not look as expected. Ultra-wide-angle lenses also make subjects in the foreground appear much bigger than those in the background.
Ultra-wide-angle lenses are not the easiest beginner lenses because it is quite tricky to get great shots with these, particularly for landscapes.
They often require a nice foreground, otherwise the shots look rather boring. However, they are awesome to photograph the Milky Way because you get such a big part of the sky into the frame.
Talking about the Milky Way, let me introduce you to another lens that I didn't have available by the time I shot at the Danube. This is a 9mm full-frame lens from Seven Artisans, so it is much wider than the 14mm lens. I just love this lens to take star trail images of the night sky, but it is also crazy wide for other stuff. For example, let me show you this interior shot created with a 9mm Seven Artisans lens. Compare that to the 14mm lens. That is pretty remarkable, right? There aren't many lenses like this one available, so it is pretty unique.
Let's continue with 16mm. As you can see, with a 14mm lens you'll get quite a bit more into the frame than with a 16mm lens, despite only being 2mm difference. The longer the focal length gets, the less difference 2mm will make. 16mm is the starting focal length of higher-end wide-angle zoom lenses that are made for full-frame cameras.
A very popular zoom range for these is 16 to 35mm.
Next we go from 16mm to 18mm. Most entry-level cameras come with a kit lens that starts at either 16mm or 18mm. Be aware though that these cameras are APS-C cameras, so they use a smaller sensor and therefore would give you the image in this frame rather than the full frame when shooting at this focal length.
All these kit lenses are rather affordable, but cannot compete with high-end lenses in regard to image quality, build quality, and most of all, focus speed. We will get to that later. However, they are a good starting point into this beautiful hobby. It is easy to decide on a lens upgrade when you have actually used the lens before and have experienced which limitation bothers you most.
Now, talking about limitations, you see that the 18mm lens in the crop sensor frame cuts away a lot of the angle of view. In our case, not a big deal, but for other shots where you really need a wide angle of view, like for an indoor shot or a city trip when you want to capture the complete building, but you cannot step further back, 18mm may not be enough. Nor may the 14mm that we discussed before. Look at how much is still cut away.
What? What are you doing here? You promised that I could promote my mailing list so that I can notify people who are interested in our upcoming new photography courses, which, as you know, will be revolutionary. Yes, I did, but maybe later. We don't have time for that now, so please. Oh, by the way, one of the courses will be totally free here on YouTube. Just check the link to the mailing list in the description. What an annoying person you are. I have good news for you. There are lenses specifically made for crop sensor cameras that make up for that. They are available as much smaller focal lengths, for example 10mm or 11mm, but they cannot be used for full frame cameras because they create heavy vignetting.
The advantages of specific APS-C lenses are that they are smaller, lighter and cheaper. The disadvantage is that you obviously cannot continue to use them should you later consider upgrading to a full frame camera.
I'm not saying that you need to upgrade to a full frame camera at any time, but when I do a tutorial about what lens to buy, I want to be thorough.
Okay, we stopped at 18mm, the next one is 20mm, which is still considered an ultra wide angle lens. The next one is 24mm, which is the first wide angle lens, so no more ultra wide angle.
What I want you to understand is that with zoom lenses you can obviously choose any focal length in between the ones I'm listing, but the ones I do list are typically available as prime lenses. More on zoom versus prime lenses later.
24mm is the starting focal length of many lenses that are recommended by photographers when they are asked for an always-on lens,
like the 24-70 or 24-105mm lenses.
After 24mm, we will get to 28mm, which is the starting focal length of some cheap alternatives to always-on lenses. From 28mm, we go to 35mm, which are both still wide-angle lenses. Next up, 50mm. Now we are at normal lenses. Most people say that these lenses represent the natural perception of the human eye best.
Now it's again time to talk about prime lenses, because many 50mm prime lenses are the most affordable lenses available.
Depending on whether you want to go for a higher end brand or rather affordable third-party brands, which might not always be as bad as their reputation, they start at around $80 new.
The big advantage of prime lenses is that they have a lower minimum aperture number, and if you watched my YouTube photography course, you know that this will create quite some important advantages. One being a lot more light, so you can shoot at lower light without having to raise ISO, but the even bigger one might be the ability to blur the background much more than with zoom lenses. Pretty dramatic difference, I would say. More on that later. I just wanted to throw that information in because these 50mm lenses are so affordable.
I will link some of them in the description along with other recommended lenses. Buying from these links will earn me some commission without you having to pay more.
So if you want to thank me for the amount of work I have put into this video, this might be your chance.
Okay, that was 50mm. Since we have just talked about kit lenses, let me throw in the longer end of most kit lenses at 55mm. Next is 70mm, which is the starting focal length of many of the popular sports lenses, which range from 70mm to 200mm, like the 70 to 200mm f2.8 and the 70 to 200mm f4. The f2.8 version of these lenses is in the bag of almost any sports photographer, but also a favorite of most wedding photographers. It's a very versatile lens, and the latest iterations have become a lot lighter and smaller than the old ones. At f2.8 they offer comparatively good background blur and let quite a bit of light into the camera, which again is good in low light situations, even though they cannot compete with prime lenses in this regard. The big downside of these professional lenses is the price. Many of the new ones cost around $3,000. If you want an alternative to that high price, let me go from the 70mm we have been before to 85mm. We have now not only left the normal lenses and went into the telephoto lenses, moreover we have reached the most popular portrait focal length. Starting with the more affordable ones at f1.8 apertures that start around $350 for third-party lenses, down to f1.4 or even f1.2. The latter will cost you a kidney again, but the 85mm f1.8 lenses are a great, rather affordable alternative if your main goal is shooting portraits. This is again the time to refer to sensor size. As you surely remember, the crop sensor camera crops into the image. And that's why the 55mm end of the kit lens that I mentioned before roughly resembles the field of view that you would get from an 85mm lens on a full frame sensor. Remember the crop factor. 55mm by 1.5 crop factor is 82.5mm, so very close to 85mm. So for portraits, the long end of the kit lens is a great focal length. Unfortunately, there is still that problem of not being able to set low aperture numbers to blur the background. But the affordable 50mm lenses I mentioned before are much better in this regard. Not as good as an 85mm on a full frame, but still much better than the kit lens. That combined with the price makes them the first lens upgrade for most photographers that like to shoot portraits and similar things. But back to the focal length comparison, we stopped at 85mm. The next one I want to list is 100mm, just because it is a round number. Then 135mm, which is the second most popular focal length for portraits. Many professionals like to photograph with the 135mm f1.8.
On a full frame, that is.
Because on a crop sensor camera, you have to stand pretty far away from your subject, which means that communication can become a little more difficult.
Believe it or not, the 135mm lens is one of my favorite sports photography lenses.
The newest versions are incredibly fast in regard to autofocus, which helps a lot for sports. And the wide aperture of f1.8 gives me some amazing shots with very low ISO settings. After 135mm, let me continue with 150mm, 180mm and 200mm, which is, as we already know, the long end of the popular sports lenses. So the 70 to 200mm sports lenses go from here to there. Not a huge range, but therefore you get very high image quality, almost indistinguishable from prime lenses.
Just remember that prime lenses still have that advantage of low f numbers. For example, at 85mm, the sports zoom fights with f2.8 versus f1.4 or even f1.2.
In a low light environment, that could mean ISO 640 versus ISO 3200. Next up is 250mm. And 300mm, which is the long end of some of the cheaper telephoto lenses.
A very popular one is the Canon 75 to 300mm. Not because it is so great, but because it is so cheap. Honestly, this lens is one of the lenses with the worst reputation in regard to image quality and focus speed. So if you can afford one of the other options, do yourself a favor. I don't want to sound like the arrogant get the latest and greatest gear guy. As you've probably realized by now, I do recommend affordable alternatives. This lens is definitely not one of them. You will read some good reviews from people, but the problem with reviews often is people don't have a reference. If you only have that 75 to 300mm, it will look great to you, because it lets you zoom in quite a bit, particularly on an APS-C camera. But if you have experienced the sharpness and focus speed of some slightly more expensive lenses, you will be disappointed.
Talking about APS-C sensors again, I hope you have realized something.
The disadvantage of the crop sensor has long turned into an advantage.
When you use a long lens, you usually want more reach, and cropping into the frame gives you that longer reach. With a 1.5 by crop factor, you basically don't get a 300mm lens, but rather a 450mm lens. That difference is quite substantial. Unfortunately, that comes with a downside because smaller sensor sizes create more noise. I have a separate video that compares the advantages and disadvantages of crop versus full frame sensor. Okay, on we go. At 300mm, we leave the lenses that come in reasonable sizes. Going higher usually means you like to photograph wildlife, birds and the like, and don't mind carrying around bigger and heavier lenses. Except for one alternative that I will introduce you to in a second. 400mm is the long end of the rather popular 100 to 400mm zoom lenses. Then there is 500mm. And 600mm, which is the long end of some bigger telephoto zooms, like the 150 to 600mm or 200 to 600mm lenses. Either are still rather affordable.
Well, at least considering that photography is an expensive hobby. For people that are interested in that range, I have another video that concentrates more on how big a subject will appear in the frame, for example for bird, wildlife and sports photography. I will link you to that at the end of the video. Talking about the genres bird, wildlife and sports photography, for the sake of completeness, I have to mention that there are 300mm, 400mm and 600mm prime lenses available.
They are exceptional in regard to focus speed, image quality, low light shooting and background blur, but they are just as exceptional in regard to price. They are way beyond most people's budget, but if you're rich and want the best possible gear, this is what you want to spend your money on. Plus, you may also want to invest into some exercising.
Because these lenses are really big and heavy.
Okay, we have reached the upper end of what I would call regularly used lenses.
Canon lately introduced an 800mm zoom lens, which has to be mentioned because it is quite affordable. I also have to mention that the lowest f number for that lens at 800mm is f9, so prepare yourself for some high ISO settings. But if you want to go beyond that, you still have a few choices.
One would be using a teleconverter. They are available as 1.4x and 2x converters and would multiply the focal length of the lens you used by 1.4x or 2x. So a 600mm lens would become an 840mm lens or even 1200mm lens.
That comes with a downside though. Not only does the image quality suffer more or less depending on the quality of the teleconverter, equally problematic can be the loss of light because you also have to multiply the aperture number with 1.4 2x. Resulting for example in f13, which might require a very high ISO. Also be aware that many teleconverters only work with specific lenses, so you cannot pop them on every lens. And let me warn you from the cheap teleconverters that come with big camera packages but are also available as separate purchase. These are absolute crap and won't make you happy. What other options do you have if you want to get even closer? My personal favorite for shooting the moon and other very distant subjects is this little friend here, but at least compared to the big telephoto lenses. Compared to a regular camera, it is still huge, even though it is very lightweight. This is a super zoom camera with a built-in lens.
It has a very tiny crop sensor and therefore crops into the image even more than the APS-C size sensor does, which means that the 500mm lens will get you a humongous equivalent focal length compared to full frame. Let me show you. 1000mm, 2000mm and even 3000mm. Pretty insane, right? Compare that to what we started with. The downside is at 3000mm you cannot really trigger the camera with your finger without introducing camera shake and with it motion blur. So I use a very sturdy tripod, a gear head for targeting my subject and a cable trigger for triggering the camera. But I get images like this, or that from the moon. Depending on moon phases, I even have to zoom out in order to get the complete moon into the frame. Another downside is, due to the small sensor, this camera creates quite a bit more noise than for example a full frame camera. But if you really need that long reach, it's basically your only option.
This beast is called P1000 and it is from Nikon. Now that you know which lens to buy, what if I told you that you're using the wrong SD card for your camera? I'll tell you why in this video.